What's going on, everyone, and welcome to episode 57 of the Data Driven Strength Podcast. We have some good news. I think this episode is going to be a banger. Zach, do you agree? You think it'll be a banger?
100%.
Yeah, and I'm currently the home office is currently set up for some lovely guests. You know, tis the season. So I'm recording out of a closet right now. So if I'm not really on point today, that's why. Or if I am on point today, you know, you get some really good take homes. It really sparks some thought for you. That's me succeeding despite the adversity. So as Josh Pate would say, all of the praise, none of the blame, and we'll see if I show up today. If not, that's why. Either way, I think Zach is going to be ready to rock. You know, we're basically done with data collection at this point for the semester. So maybe a little bit more sleep, maybe a little bit more mental clarity. You know, now that Zach is not, you know, totally in the mix of the meat and potatoes of his PhD, he's taken on some clients as well for the first time in a while, which is cool. So shoot him a message if you're interested in that. But yeah, I think we're going to have hopefully at least an okay show today.
Better than the Buckeyes, man.
Yeah, better than Buckeyes. We might get into some of the sign stealing allegations today. There's whether they still had the signs for this game is to be determined. But what is it? 10 of the last 13? Is that what we got?
Yeah, there you go. Cope.
10 of the last 13. I would rather be on our side of that still. Maybe a couple more years, and I'd rather be on the other side. But we got a little bit of a buffer.
100%. Yeah. No, we're hurting this week, but the show must go on, right?
The show must go on. Okay. What are we going to talk about today?
Cool. So, you know, the combination of conversations we've been having recently, and also kind of combining some of the spirit of a lot of our recent YouTube content, has just been discussing kind of the concept of does performance, and particularly in the acute sense is what I mean when I say that, does that quote unquote matter for the adaptations that we usually talk about being, you know, strength and hypertrophy. So just to frame the discussion appropriately, when I say performance, I'm talking about does maximizing my output for a given repetition RAR combination, and, you know, obviously sets is part of this equation as well. So let's say maximizing my output for 5 reps at a 2 RAR within a given session, does that inherently influence the stimulus and ultimately the chronic adaptations related for strength and hypertrophy respectively? And it's an interesting topic, and I think one that sometimes maybe gets a little bit oversimplified. Obviously, we've talked about the strength stuff quite a bit, and we'll talk about that a little bit today, but I think the hypertrophy conversation is one that we've been having more and more recently and revisited with maybe a fresh pair of eyes, particularly with Josh's most recent YouTube video, kind of going over the some of the training concepts that can be accessed with some newer technology, like the tonal. So I don't know if you think that's a fair framing.
Yeah, I listened to most of what you said. I was just looking at the Ohio State, Michigan all-time results, and looking at the last, basically since 2000, I see a lot more Ohio State than Michigan. So eat that, Dr. Zordos. And but yeah, I think that's a pretty good framing. And I'd say from like an intellectual perspective, or just from like things that we're thinking about perspective, we kind of go on these little spurts of like, okay, we kind of have new research coming out or new things that we just kind of observe in the lab or observe with our clients or whatever the case may be. And it often, or at least sometimes, converges on kind of like a keystone concept that I think is important to explore, because then that keystone concept can kind of apply beyond the direct results of a study. So let's take the pre-printed meta-regression on proximity to failure that you led, Zach, and we'll have some more kind of, I guess, finalized or uh, like once it's properly published and kind of further along in the whole research process, if you will, we'll have some more content on that. But let's just kind of painting with uh, broad strokes here. Let's just say that training closer to failure, we can have a good amount of confidence at this point is better than training further from failure. Very, I think, safe assumption at this point. Um, a lot of folks will still kind of like take that and say, but make sure it doesn't harm your next session's performance, for example. Or, make sure it doesn't, make sure that first set of the session, you don't train too hard so that the second set is compromised too much, right? But then you think about it and you're like, wait, these training studies, like these are real people, like this isn't like just a computer simulation of results, and then 20 years later you can spit it into a meta regression, and then we understand the perfect skeletal muscle physiology of a single set. It's like, no, there are limitations to these study designs, right, in terms of the length of the intervention, the population, et cetera. But these are nonetheless still real human beings in a laboratory being trained by people often with master's degrees, multiple personal training or strength coaching certifications. Like, these are real studies, and we still see in these applied outcome studies, right, when they're actually measuring strength and hypertrophy, we see these results nonetheless. We'll definitely have some more discussion and content on training volume as well over the next handful of months with some projects we're working on, and that will be available in the short to moderate term. But I'll just use the Ennis study as a recent one. That's definitely, I think it's safe to say, made the rounds. We had a post on it as well. And again, I think a lot of people will look at that study and say, okay, extremely high volumes, or let's just say higher volumes in general. They'll say, okay, they're better, but make sure you can not feel, or make sure that you still feel perfectly fresh going into your next session for that muscle group, right? And then you just start to, kind of combining our experience of being in the lab on a regular basis, and now we've been doing this for multiple years, and kind of seeing some of the discussion and some things we would kind of take issue with. It's like, okay, it's kind of converging on this question of like, are those assumptions that people jump to when they kind of add these caveats to the outcomes, are they true? And then also, I still think it just, every time I say it in some sort of content, I'm like, I feel like this is so obvious, but people still butcher this a lot, is they assume that strength outcomes and hypertrophy outcomes can kind of be like intermixed, or in other words, they can take strength outcomes and assume they also apply for hypertrophy, or vice versa. And I feel like I've said it a lot, and it seems silly to keep saying it, but it just is confused a lot. So anyway, we'll probably get into that differentiation, but that monologue there, I think, was just kind of to explain some of the background and perhaps equip you with, again, just the kind of additional perspective or reminder that these training studies don't happen in a vacuum. They're actual training studies, and we have to kind of take the outcomes and put together some concepts based on multiple lines of research of, what keystone concept can we carry forward. So I think that's kind of what we'll get into specifically with training performance.
Yeah, and I think to maybe just add like a concrete example of kind of what Josh is saying, to keep things in the proximity to failure kind of conversation, is a common narrative. That sounds like negative. I don't mean it like that. A common question when you talk about potentially the advantage of training closer to, or maybe even to, failure for hypertrophy is that, oh, but that causes a lot of fatigue, right? It's going to harm my performance in my next set, like Josh said. I'm going to get really sore. I might not be able to use as heavy a loads as I would normally do in my next session, things like that. That's an extremely intuitive position to come to and a natural question to bring up. But the next kind of layer of it you have to ask is, well, the individuals in the studies that are training every set to failure or very close to it, those probably had the same experiences that you just mentioned. They probably were a bit more sore. They probably did have their training performance a bit artificially harmed. They probably did have maybe even less motivation and a little bit of dread going into the session. And it's probably not entirely representative of an entire training program. Obviously, typically studies are done in a few muscles or a few movements, but nonetheless, those type of experiences still occur from our experience in the lab. So the actual outcomes that we care about typically reign supreme in kind of those conversations, to say that that may be occurring, but it's maybe not sufficient to justify an alternative principle that goes against from the actual applied outcomes that we see, which is kind of the key. That's that key piece that Josh is kind of talking about, is we need to take the complementary bodies of research, and particularly the applied outcomes related to those, and paint together this narrative and this ultimate kind of mental model to actually put down a program on a piece of paper, rather than the initial maybe concerns with doing so. Now, I'm not going to say to not interpret the data critically. There's obviously limitations that are going to influence the practical application, but I think that comes as a secondary layer as opposed to a primary layer, in my opinion, for the most part. Is we take the data for what they are, obviously have a nuanced contextual interpretation, and then you apply your logical and ultimately slightly different context in which you're applying those results than the exact volumes, exercise selection, population, training frequency, organization of training throughout the week, all those kind of things that are going to be slightly different than how you actually applied in practice. But ultimately, you're going to deviate from that basic principle that's actually coming from the applied outcomes, rather than just saying that the applied outcomes don't apply. At least that is my opinion on how to best kind of apply this stuff. So the reason that's relevant is, okay, there's starting to seem kind of multiple lines of research that, in to some degree, and I'll kind of pitch it to you, Josh, and you'll leave you something open ended here so you can kind of get started, that all tend to suggest that worrying about decreases in acute performance for hypertrophy may not be as big of a concern than we maybe once thought. So, as an example, just a few that are coming off the top of my head, but you'll probably have a more cohesive list. The load that we train with, so the percentage of 1RM. There's a really, really wide range of loads that are going to be available. In addition to that, if we are training with really light loads, with sets to failure, I think this is something that isn't often talked about, you're going to have a pretty big reduction set to set in a load you can lift for like a 20 to 30 RM. So we're even getting dips after that if we're going to be maintaining that for multiple sets of performance. So there's a really wide range of loads that can work for hypertrophy, meaning we don't have to lift a maximal load in order to get a sufficient hypertrophy stimulus. So that's kind of one variable that has a range, or a big wide amount of decrease that can happen throughout a session and still be a productive load for hypertrophy. Proximity to failure, another one that we just discussed. Training closer to failure is absolutely going to reduce your performance on the next set in comparison to training with 5+ RAR, but that may not matter, because as long as you're able to go to failure on the next set, that next set potentially is just as stimulative or very close to it, as we'll kind of discuss. As a final one, some of the rest interval and stuff, research like that, particularly with kind of factoring in intensity techniques like drop sets, myo reps, things like that, also could be kind of part of this story where there's a little bit of conflicting data there, at least from our interpretation of kind of how that influences the ultimate hypertrophy outcomes that we see. In that the direct rest interval research, typically the kind of the soundbite you'll hear is that longer rest intervals are going to allow for a more efficient hypertrophy per set, whereas some of the intensity technique stuff, which is the most extreme of the short rest interval research, maybe doesn't tell the exact same story. There's limitations to this, but just as one example, there was a recent meta-analysis by Max Coleman and colleagues that shows basically equivalent outcomes between drop sets and traditional sets for hypertrophy. Once again, there's a few limitations there. Some of the studies are not set equated for the drop sets, but if you take the fatigue narrative literally, that probably wouldn't be an expectation that you would have, that the drop sets are just as good for hypertrophy than straight sets, as an example. So there's a few different places where artificially harming your acute performance with some of these training variables actually leads to equivalent or superior outcomes. So with that said, Josh, go ahead, take us away.
Yeah, I think that was that's a great way to frame it, right? And I'll start by saying that things don't line up perfectly across all the areas of research that I'm going to kind of quickly go through right now. Um, but hopefully we can connect the dots to some degree, layer in some uncertainty here and there, especially when things kind of don't align or they don't check out, and also just based on the amount of research we have in some of these areas. And then we can hopefully come to some sort of mental model for hypertrophy specifically. So I'll quickly run through some research in kind of this advanced training techniques area. The reason I like to start with, or I want to start with advanced training techniques here is because effectively what an advanced training technique is, and I'm going to specifically frame this around drop sets and rest pause. So just to make sure we're on the same page, a drop set is basically one normal set and then immediately followed by one or multiple drops. So let's say you're doing curls with the 40s, you immediately drop it to whatever the 30s or the 35s after, and then you could potentially do additional drops beyond that. And then another uh, advanced training technique I'll layer in here is rest pause training, which effectively lets you use the example of doing curls with the 40-pound dumbbells. After you do kind of a normal set, you put the dumbbells down or you rest for anywhere from like, let's call it 5 to 30 seconds, and then you do additional reps, and then you can repeat that kind of mini rest interval again and do additional reps. Okay. There are other advanced training techniques, things like extenuated eccentrics, where you use a heavier load on the eccentric, super slow training. Sometimes the research even considers like German volume training advanced training technique. I'd kind of have some gripes with that because to me, that's just higher volume training. I believe there's the classic sarcoplasma emphasis training or something that's kind of a mix of drop set and rest pause. So there are other sort of advanced training techniques, but nonetheless, the reason I want to use drop sets and rest pause are because I think they are probably the most commonly used or discussed. They're arguably the best researched, potentially, and most importantly, effectively, what these are doing are they are essentially using the acute fatigue from a given set to presumably amplify the responsiveness of the forthcoming repetitions, right? So in the case of a drop set, if you finish that set of with the 40-pound dumbbells and then you drop it to the 30s, presumably those reps with the 30s right away are going to be more effective than if you were to go and do those reps with the 30-pound dumbbells and you went into that fresh, right? Same idea with rest pause. You're effectively cutting out on the early reps and jumping straight into the later, more quote unquote effective reps by leveraging kind of that acute fatigue. Now, because you're leveraging that acute fatigue, you are doing just that. You are acutely fatiguing yourself and you are effectively less strong in that given moment. You have a lower force capacity in that given moment, right? So if I do a set with the 40-pound dumbbells to failure, I can probably lift 38 or 39-pound dumbbells if those theoretically existed. Um, but I can no longer lift what I could lift at the beginning of the set. And presumably that leads to a more effective rep. So anyway, that's a long way of saying I'm interested specifically for this discussion of strategies that essentially amplify the acute fatigue to potentially get a greater hypertrophy stimulus, question mark, that's kind of what we'll be discussing, or a more efficient hypertrophy stimulus. So I'll quickly run through some representative research. So you mentioned the meta-analysis from Max Coleman and colleagues, basically comparing all the studies that used a drop set protocol versus kind of a traditional straight set protocol, and they did not find a difference between the two conditions in a handful of studies. Was it like 7 or 8 studies or something like that? Somewhere in that ballpark.
Sounds right.
I mentioned in a recent YouTube video that in the drop set conditions, on average, they did slightly more sets. I think it was about 30% more sets. And that's assuming that you count like one of the drop sets as an individual set. So you could make the argument that, hey, maybe the drop sets themselves are less effective in isolation. It's kind of hard to say, right? Not a ton of research. I would kind of expect, like, let's say a meta-analysis where the average was like 13 sets versus 10 sets per week. I'd probably expect that to kind of result in greater hypertrophy with the higher volume condition, even though that's a relatively small difference. But nonetheless, pretty similar hypertrophy there with drop sets. To kind of take a step back and think about even a more broad meta-analysis, there was one from Fonseca and colleagues from 2023. It's titled Comparison of Traditional and Advanced Resistance Training Paradigms on Muscle Hypertrophy in Trained Individuals, a Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis. This was an interesting meta-analysis because they kind of chucked in a bunch of, or chucked, that has a negative connotation. I don't mean that in a negative way, but they had a broad inclusion criteria in terms of the types of advanced training techniques or advanced training paradigms put into the meta-analysis. So they even included like German volume training as like an advanced training technique, or extenuated eccentrics. But basically what you see is that no matter what sort of advanced training technique you use, if you compare it to traditional training and you have some sort of reasonable way of kind of equalizing the two in terms of the dose, it doesn't seem to really lead to more hypertrophy. So we basically have two meta-analyses showing that things like drop sets, rest pause, and some other advanced training techniques are pretty dang similar when you compare them to traditional resistance training. And then if we think about individual studies, I'm going to quickly run through a study by, I believe this was from Allison Ennis as well. This is from 2021. I like this study because I think they did a pretty good job, or I think the design lends itself pretty well to controlling the variable of proximity to failure. It also compared traditional straight set training to drop set training and to rest pause training. So it's kind of a nice all-in-one study. And I think they did a pretty good job of, or the best I could think of, in terms of equating overall training dose. So the traditional resistance training group in that study performed 4 sets of 12 with 70% of their 1 rep max, which is to standardize 2 minutes between sets. So pretty straightforward, stock standard resistance training protocol. The drop set protocol basically used, so they did 3 of these sets, and each set was a set with 75% of their 1RM for 10 reps. Okay, and then they immediately dropped it to 55% of their 1RM and performed 6 reps. But they did that 3 times. So a little bit less total sets, but if you add up volume load, it's very similar, which we have some gripes generally with volume load, but I think that's an okay way to kind of think about it in this case. Now, the rest pause protocol also performed 3 sets as opposed to the 4 in the traditional group, but they didn't drop the load. So they just used that 75% of 1RM, did 10 reps, and then rested 20 seconds, and then did 6 reps with that same load, and then rested a full 2 minutes before doing the next rest pause protocol. So just generally, straight sets versus using a given load, dropping it about 20%, versus using the same load, doing kind of a mini rest, and then doing a few more reps with that same load. And there were no differences in hypertrophy in this study. There's another recent study by, I'm gonna butcher this, Fasahian and colleagues. Zach's laughing at me, but he's on mute. That's totally butchered. I'm sorry to the lead author. They didn't have a direct measurement of hypertrophy here. They measured, I believe it was technically skeletal muscle mass or lean body mass, one of the two. But basically, they compared a traditional 4 sets of 10 training protocol to a group that did a single drop set protocol, and then a third group that did a multiple drop set protocol. So the single drop set protocol used 80% of their 1RM, went to failure, and then rested 90 seconds. Or sorry, they went directly into 45% of their 1RM and went to failure. And they did that twice. And then in the multiple drop set protocol, they started with a heavier load, dropped it to 65%, immediately dropped it to 50, immediately dropped it to 35, but they only did that once. So effectively, you have these 4 groups, either traditional training, single drop set, or multi-drop set, and they effectively equated like failure points here, right? And they saw similar outcomes in terms of the total muscle mass metric that they had here. So effectively, when you lump all of what I just went on about together, we see that traditional resistance training compared to some of these advanced training techniques, specifically drop sets and rest pause, it seems to be pretty similar in terms of outcomes if you do a pretty good job of equating the overall dose. Now, you could take that to the bank and say, oh, if I'm training for an hour and I'm doing whatever 6 sets per muscle group, I might as well just do the multiple drop set protocol. It's going to be way more time efficient. I'm going to get the same results. And why not? There's really no downside. If anything, I could just do more work, right? And still less time or in the same amount of time. And I think if you look at the advanced training technique research in a vacuum, that's not a terrible takeaway, to be honest. However, I do think things get interesting when you just take into account the fact that there's not like a super robust advanced training technique body of research overall. And also when you think about some of the outcomes we've seen in the rest period research as well. So we can get into some of those caveats, which ultimately lead to some practical models that we can kind of loosely hold for now. But I'll pause there and see if you want to add anything to that, Zach.
Not really. Honestly, I think this area is like it's one of the areas I'm a little bit disappointed we don't have more stuff, because I feel like it's such a game changer, right? Like if we can indeed get equivalent outcomes with a fraction of the training time, you have two benefits there. A, we can get the more time outside of the gym back to get the equivalent outcomes that we still are. Or B, like you said, we can potentially pack in more training to the time that we're willing to commit to training. And, maybe the relationships there are a little bit unclear, particularly if you're talking about strength, but potentially get more return on our investment in terms of total training time if we're able to pack more training into that window. So, this is just an area I wish, we have a little bit more dedicated towards it. And obviously that's calling a spade, that we can fix that if we, that's one of the studies we could potentially do down the line.
Get to work, buddy.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So that is just one area I am interested in for a lot of different reasons, because I think it tells us this potentially mechanistic question. It gives us a little bit of a window into that, and can help us, at least theoretically, kind of explore the influence of other variables as well. But it also, just from a practical perspective, is really, really interesting. So, I really don't have much to add in terms of the explanation, other than I do think this area of research needs more. It's interesting, and the kind of additional context you're going to put on it with the rest interval research is interesting as well.
Yeah. So let's talk about the rest interval research. And I think the best cited study here is from Schoenfeld, which kind of the headline finding here is that longer rest periods on a per set basis lead to more muscle growth than shorter rest periods, is ultimately what the take home there is. And there are at least one or two additional studies that align with that. There's also a study from Longo and colleagues, which effectively had I believe it was 4 groups, if I'm remembering this right off the top of my head, comparing one group that did so 2 of the groups had the same number of sets, right, with shorter rest periods and longer rest periods. And the longer rest period group saw greater hypertrophy, and then they had an additional group, so maybe it was only 3 groups.
It's four.
Okay, but the next group that's at least of interest to our discussion here, they did additional work to make up for the decreased volume load from the shorter rest periods, right? And that kind of recovered the muscle growth when you compare it to that longer rest period group. Does that check out to you, Zach? And I'm forgetting the 4th group off the top of my head.
It was basically one of so it was like kind of 2 within participant designs. One of them did the volume load for the short rest condition, kind of it is what it is, and then they matched the volume load with the long rest condition, so they ended up doing less sets, I believe, than the short rest condition. And then in the other example, they were matching the volume load from the short rest condition to the long rest condition, so they were doing additional sets with the short rest condition. And basically it showed that, like you said, the additional sets for the short rest group basically recovers the difference in hypertrophy when volume load is matched to the the longer rest condition, potentially
Yeah.
indicating that the shorter rest is what's causing that effect because they tested the counterfactual.
Right. So, okay, if you take those studies and uh, you can easily come away with the take home that longer rests are definitely better for hypertrophy on a per set basis. Um, I don't necessarily disagree with that take home. I guess the only thing that I would just add a little bit of caution to that. I think there are at least two studies that I'm aware of that either find no difference in terms of uh, shorter versus longer rest periods, and at least one study that finds greater hypertrophy from shorter rest periods. Now, the specific study from Fink and colleagues that I'm thinking of did not equate the rep ranges, but based on other research, probably should have been similar effectiveness. I think it was 8 reps per set compared to 20 reps per set. And I also believe that study was in older individuals, which could be an additional uh, kind of thing that changes the directionality here. But nonetheless, I would add just a little bit of caution to the general take home of longer rest periods definitely being better for hypertrophy. I still lean that way in practice. I'd still recommend biasing towards just resting as long as you need to be fully or mostly, or almost fully recovered going into a set. Um, but there is a little bit of uncertainty there. So let's assume the affirmative. Let's assume that longer rest periods are better for hypertrophy, right? But then let's also return back to these advanced training techniques, things like drop sets and rest pause. And we have some research indicating that these are similarly effective to straight set training. How can we kind of hold both of these to be true at the same time? Um, Zach, do you want to jump in here and take a swing?
Yeah,
Okay, cool.
sure. So ultimately, just to recap what Josh is pointing out here is that typically the rest interval research is going to show that taking shorter rests, which are going to harm your acute performance, is going to potentially impair hypertrophy if we were going to equate sets. Is that is the essentially the soundbite there? Although, like he said, it's not uber consistent across all the studies. Whereas the intensity technique research, particularly with drop sets and myo reps, basically say that which is the most extreme form of short rest intervals, to mind you, is that drop sets and rest pause. You're basically taking no rest, right? And obviously, there's caveats there, particularly with the drop sets research. They perform maybe a couple extra sets here and there, but ultimately they show equivalent outcomes with traditional training, which basically contradict one another. So, what could be going on here? Ultimately, I am going to split the drop set research and the mile rep research personally when I'm interpreting this. So, in my opinion, what I think is kind of the most likely explanation here, at least one possible candidate hypothesis that could be tested, is that when you look at the rest interval research, to my knowledge, there's not a ton of studies that investigate rest intervals with heavy load training, and I'm going to mention that somewhere in the 5 to 8 rep range, something like that. And my opinion is short rest intervals are going to magnify the discomfort associated with low load training and higher repetition training, such that our ability to reach task failure is impaired meaningfully. It's already challenging to get people to actually get to momentary failure with a set of 20 on leg press. There's no way you're going to do that with high repetition sets, at least the high repetition target, and short rest intervals. That's just going to magnify that experience out the wazoo. Heck, we even have trouble getting people to momentary failure for like moderate load training, let alone low load training. So that's just going to magnify that entire situation. So one of the reasons the drop set studies may require a few extra sets to get that equivalent outcome is because drop set research is pushing you farther in that direction. The repetition range is going to be increasing as you're decreasing the load, not a ton because you're getting weaker as well, but you're also taking short rest intervals, which is going to magnify the discomfort as we approach task failure. Alternatively, myo reps are actually going to decrease the number of repetitions that we're performing or rest pause training. And to me, that is going to counteract the increase in discomfort that is going to be associated with the short rest interval. And ultimately, the thing that I think explains these factors is that I don't know if there's a huge mechanistic disadvantage, although some people would definitely disagree with that, to be clear. There's some, acute data, particularly looking at like myofibrillar protein synthesis and things like that, that you could point to that is potentially harmed from short rest training. However, I would still kind of, from the practical perspective, you still have to do a resistance training protocol with that. And that kind of falls into the same limitations to what I'm saying here, is that with short rest and higher repetition sets that involve a ton of muscle mass, all of those things are increasing the discomfort associated with task failure, and potentially get to the extent in people who aren't particularly well affiliated with those conditions that you can never reach it. And that, to me, given what I don't want to say no, but we suspect is there a dose response relationship with proximity to failure and hypertrophy, if those conditions are substantially different, meaning that we are in a meaningfully different proximity to failure zone with the short rest research than the traditional research, particularly if we're lifting moderate to low loads, that could substantially influence outcomes to the extent that it shows up that we don't have as much of a hypertrophy response from those conditions. So putting that all together, if you are able to reach task failure appropriately, I think the conditions will be sufficient for you to maximally stimulate hypertrophy on a per set basis, is the ultimate hypothesis and implication that I'm putting forward. However, that is just my kind of trying to piece these things together with all the research that we have, and definitely is something that needs to be tested. If I saw to put my cards on the table, if I saw a heavy load short rest interval research, I would have a decent amount less confidence in what I just put forward. That would be one of the designs I would want to see to kind of test what I'm saying, is that if we have a group that's performing, let's say leg press for moderate volumes per week, one group is doing long rest, the other group's doing short rest, and it's somewhere in the 5 to 8 rep range, or 5 to 8 RM loading range, and they still see an inhibitory effect of short rest intervals. Obviously, I could still make the caveat that I don't know if they're reaching task failure in those conditions because I wasn't there, but I'm substantially less confident in kind of the mental model that I just put forward. But let me know what you think about that.
So, if I'm understanding correctly, kind of what you're getting at is the acute performance. So, what this really comes down to is kind of intraset fatigue. If you kind of even take like a drop set, right, and you take if you just say that's one whole set. Let's say I started with 80% or so, I dropped to 60, and then now I'm at 40 after my second drop. So a really light load. Let's say that theoretically I was able to do like a set of 8 with 40% of 1RM, and let's just assume for sure that that was true momentary failure, which I definitely agree. A big limitation here is that is the target muscle actually failing with these short rest periods or drop sets or myo reps. But let's say we can assume and we know for sure that that set of 8 with 40% was to true momentary failure. Do you think that set of 8 with 40% is just as effective as a set with their 8RM where they went into it fresh?
I would say I would still suspect it's going to be marginally worse in terms of the stimulus, but to the extent that we can measure it and detect it in a study, I would say probably practically equivalent is what my hypothesis would be there.
Okay.
So long as the drop set is above the kind of a minimum loading threshold required for hypertrophy ultimately. So like somewhere around 20-30% of 1RM, as long as that final drop is still kind of exceeding that, I think you're probably still able to benefit from it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And then let's take myo reps to also kind of do a thought experiment there. So let's say you're using about 70% of your max, whatever. Let's just say like a 12 RM. You go 12 RM to failure, and then you rest 30 seconds, and then use that same load to failure again. And let's say with that kind of set, that mini set that was after the 30-second rest, let's say you get 6 reps to momentary failure. Let's again assume that you do get to true momentary failure there. Do you think those 6 reps uh, are just as effective as the 6 reps at the end of the first set?
I wouldn't say just as. I would say there's probably still, we can kind of get to
So
our,
same answer basically.
yeah, practical equivalent is what I would say.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um, and just to make sure, I guess the listener and me totally on the same page. Let's say we're using a 12RM, and there's let's compare between conditions: long rest period condition and short rest period condition. So 12RM in the first set. Okay, same thing. We haven't even gotten to a rest period yet. In the short rest period group, let's say they rest 1 minute, and then they go to failure with their new 12RM. Let's just say you could theoretically know exactly what their 12RM is under those conditions, so they dropped it, whatever, 15%. So in each of these conditions, the second set is a 12RM, but the performance was lower in the short rest period condition. Would your answer again be the same there?
Yep. So long as the final load is still above the loading threshold, I
The
would
loading
expect those to
threshold.
be practically equivalent. And
Then
so
why do you think the Longo study didn't necessarily find that?
because I'm questioning whether they reach task failure ultimately.
Right. And and
Is
and,
the
and that's not a knock on
No, no,
these
not at
papers
all,
by any
not at
means.
all.
That's
I
just
like I said,
laying the game.
I think, um, yeah, it's just we've had, we've done, I don't even know how many sets to failure at this point in the lab, and moderate load conditions, we still struggle sometimes to get people to the true extent of failing a repetition. And I'm just imagining that in short rep conditions or short rest conditions, when you're training with moderate loads, that magnifies the experience that we've basically only trained with, long rest intervals basically. I would just assume that's just going to magnify the experience of discomfort in
Yeah.
your average recreationally trained participant to the extent that they're probably not at the same proximity to failure ultimately.
Yeah.
And so now, from a mechanistic perspective, again, I think you can definitely make a convincing argument that those later sets maybe are not a one-to-one stimulus, and I'm not
Yeah.
disputing that. But I think that is magnified from an actual outcomes perspective when you look at the research that we do have, because of the fact that I think it's a mechanistic difference from potentially short rest intervals to also not having an equated primary training variable anymore, being proximity to failure. So I think
Yeah.
if, you could look at a couple different things, like, I think you got marginal benefits across the research to conditions that minimize that type of fatigue. So if you pin my arm down and said, is straight sets more effective than the intensity techniques on a per set basis, I would say, yeah, probably marginally. But from a practical measurement perspective, is that going to actually show up? And when we kind of compare these things, I don't think so. Particularly, I mean, not particularly, but if the sufficient conditions are met, meaning they're actually able to reach true task failure in the shorter rest, higher rep conditions, etc. So
Yeah.
hopefully that makes sense. But that, to
Yeah.
me, that's the meaningful distinction between like myo reps and drop sets, where I think myo reps have an edge, is because you are basically trying to increase the probability that you can tolerate task failure because the repetition range is actually decreasing. Whereas the drop set condition is you're basically maintaining or maybe even slightly increasing the repetition range with the drops in load. It's not going to be what it was if you would have lifted that load fresh, but you're increasing the discomfort because the rest intervals are short, and you're going to maintain or maybe even increase the repetition range, which typically a higher repetition range come with greater discomfort. Whereas that's not the case in a mile rep type situation. So
Yeah.
that's ultimately that's what I think. But I
Yeah.
really want to see that tested, because I don't know. I know, like I said, I know a lot of people don't share that same position, but I think it's at least plausible to me
Yeah.
why that kind of all those areas kind of relate. And I think that's further magnified. Another point that's discussed is the exercise selection, and I think that discomfort is further modified by the amount of muscle mass that's involved. Going to true momentary failure in a squat is already a challenging task at moderate loads for a single set. doing that for multiple sets with moderate to high repetition ranges and drop sets, man, I'm relatively skeptical if that's reaching true task failure in those conditions, ultimately.
Yeah. Uh, and we kind of went through those thought experiments for each drop sets, myoreps, and just like traditional training but shorter rest periods. And I said, hey, let's put the whole like discomfort perception of effort actually reaching task failure thing, let's put that to the side. And I just want to make it clear to the listener that like that's for thought experiment reasons only. And when you kind of layer that back in from a practical perspective, that matters a lot. And even if you're aware of it, I don't necessarily think that makes you immune to it. Um, and further, like in a lab setting, someone can reach quote unquote task failure or momentary muscular failure, like like everyone in the world would agree, yes, they just failed that set. Um, but what's going on under the hood and what actually causes them to fail that set might not necessarily be the same. So I think that's just like another layer of caution of why I think Zach and I can like speculate as to why these sets under high acute fatigue could be close or potentially even just as effective, but why they're not the safest route to go, right? Let's say you did this, your session RPE or just like overall uh you know, like discomfort under the curve, I don't know, whatever you want to call it from training, just goes way up, right? Another thing we could discuss here is some of the downstream effects on fatigue. Let's put a pin in that. But anyway, I think that's important to keep in mind is that if you do a double drop and you're using 40% and you do convince yourself you just went to failure, like, I don't know, man, I feel like there's always kind of another rep, right? And sometimes it probably even seems that way under a lab setting when if there's multiple researchers there, let alone, you know, training alone without kind of that external
And
pressure. So
I think another practical layer to it, if you just my experience using kind of intensity techniques for certain exercises, is like your system wants to escape that position of discomfort at all costs. But that is in direct opposition to what we want to do for hypertrophy. For strength and like the execution of a motor task, your body's trying to figure out the most efficient way to distribute the loading demands to complete the task, which is, again, the exact opposite of what we want for hypertrophy. We're specifically putting our joints and our levers in inefficient positions to stress the desired tissues. And so if I'm doing a lateral raise for my third drop set, your execution is probably going to start changing to not fry your lateral delts like you have been for the last minute 30 seconds. So it's just all those things can kind of influence, okay, what does it mean when I say you're not able to reach task failure? It's not just that you're giving up on that 30th rep. I'm not just saying that. It's also you're still trying as hard as you can, but now the direction of force is a little bit more of a front raise than it is in the original position. So now what's actually reaching task failure in that case? It's not from a lack of effort in that regard. It's a lack of specificity to the actual tissue that we were originally trying to target. So there's a lot of different layers to it that just make reaching task failure not as straightforward that as I think people say, like, yep, okay, short rest intervals are worse for hypertrophy, hands off, there it is, boom, conversation over. I tend not to think about it that way, just with our experience with all the little nuances of carrying out, a training session that can't be ignored ultimately.
yeah. So let's kind of return to that example of like your after your second drop, a set of 8 with 40% of 1RM. Let's say it theoretically is to true momentary failure. I think some people might hear that and say like, okay, these guys are saying that it might be close to as effective as a set of 8 to failure under normal conditions. And then and they might hear that and they might be like, oh, but I thought mechanical tension is like the main driver of hypertrophy. And I think this gets into an important uh, point to clarify about what mechanical tension actually is and what drives kind of the biochemical cascade that ultimately leads to muscle protein synthesis. And I also think this can be a jumping off point to talk about why different rep ranges seem to lead to similar hypertrophy. So the kind of the key point here is that mechanical tension occurs on the fiber level, not necessarily from tendon to tendon, right? So your whole muscle force production doing a set to failure with 40% of 1RM under very fatigued conditions is much lower than if you were to do that set of failure when you're fresh with your true 8RM load. And the reason that could lead to similar uh, growth, presumably at least largely in part due to similar levels of mechanical tension, is that the muscle fibers that are in the ball game are going to be experiencing very high levels of tension. However, there might be some motor units that have effectively cycled out at that point, and they may no longer be contributing to the force demands under those very fatiguing conditions. And then you can use that same concept of saying, okay, if you're performing a slow repetition, whether it's the fifth rep of a set of 5 to failure or the 30th rep of a set of 30 to failure, those are going to be roughly the same velocity. And the muscle fibers that are in the game are going to be experiencing similar-ish levels of mechanical tension, assuming you're truly, at the same proximity to failure. The difference, or at least my current thinking, and Zach, you can let me know if you can poke any holes in this, is that the difference here is the number of muscle fibers effectively in the game for those slow repetitions, right? And the difference is that with a longer set, those some of the muscle fibers that aren't in the game at the end of the set have effectively cycled out and experienced those high levels of mechanical tension previously, like earlier in the set. Would you agree with that rough framework?
Yeah, I think so. I think ultimately the practical implications. I'm sorry for Maya; she's really not liking what's ever going on outside. Um, the the kind of what was I going to say? Implications is not the right word, but I'm going to use it anyway. What you're saying is that you're taking, in the former case, the heavier load example, you're taking a heavier mass and distributing that force demand or torque requirement to lift it across a greater pool of fibers. But because we have a greater mass, we ultimately are going to have a solid stimulus delivered to most of the active fibers. Whereas in the case of lower loads, because the force requirement or the torque requirements are lower, not all of the fibers come to the metaphorical party right away or take some time to do so. Thus, at any one point in time, the torque requirements are distributed over a smaller number of fibers. So even though the torque is less, the participating fibers are lower. So the basic division equation is roughly equivalent there. And then the additional piece of complexity is that throughout a set, to some degree, the reps at the end of the set might be a little bit more of a per fiber mechanical event, because within each condition, less of those fibers are participating. Thus, a fixed mass is distributed over less active fibers. Ultimately, is the kind of the calculus there. And yeah, I think I agree with that as a basic general framework. I think it tends to explain things pretty well. And I think for the most part, although EMG is limited, obviously that's pretty much what you see in the EMG research, in the sense that any one snapshot of EMG is going to show relatively similar activities. Not what I want to use, but that's the only word that's coming to mind at the moment. A similar EMG value, let's say, for the high load training and kind of like a area under the curve for the low load training. It's not going to be in any one snapshot. They're not going to be equivalent because less myoelectrical activity is occurring in the low load condition. But when you kind of summate things over the duration of the set, relatively similar. And so that, is going to jive pretty well with the research on actually examining hypertrophy in response to high and low loads. Take things to failure doesn't seem to really matter. There's a underappreciated study by Lim and colleagues that actually does non-failure low load training that I think it does a good job of kind of looking at this. It was 80% to failure, 30% to failure, and the 30% workload match, which is volume load basically, to the higher load condition, and doesn't show as much hypertrophy in that condition, which basically is kind of supporting. The interesting thing in that study, which always is kind of a head scratcher for me, is that the meaningful hypertrophy was actually in the type 2 fibers, which either could be, some people would take the position that that's impossible because the type 2 fibers are going to be controlled in the highest threshold motor units, and not going to failure in the 30% condition, you're never going to reach a meaningful stimulus for those fibers. The alternative position is type 2 fibers just grow more. So any sort of stimulus there could lead to growth there, but it's just an interesting nugget from that study that I think is kind of underappreciated, but I'll quit rambling. I agree with your mental model, and I think it makes sense kind of trying to piece together the pieces that we have.
Yeah. And that's strictly through the kind of, I guess, per fiber tension lens of hypertrophy. It's probably deserves its own episode or a segment in a future episode to think about how the metabolic stress layer, or how metabolic stress might layer into this in terms of stimulating hypertrophy. I do think it's effectively impossible to differentiate the two, or isolate the two, I should say, in a training study. Now, there are definitely like some clever methods you could gain insight into this question, but like by I guess what I'm trying to guard against is saying that, like, oh, higher rep training drives the stimulus through metabolic stress, and lower rep training, higher load training, drives the stimulus through tension. I guess that could be the case in part, but it does not necessarily conflict with a model in which mechanical tension is the per fiber mechanical tension is driving the stimulus, but the avenue by which you get there is similar. Now, there could be the possibility that, hey, in a lot of these studies examining high reps, they're not actually getting to true momentary failure, given the limitations of that, as we talked about. So you kind of sprinkle in the metabolic stress dust into that stimulus a little bit, and super scientific analogy there, and then things kind of become equated. That could be possible, but I think the safest kind of mental model for this at the current time is thinking about that per fiber mechanical tension at any given repetition, and how that can add up over the course of a set, whether it's a one of those mini sets in a MyRep set, or one of the drop sets, or the second rep with short rest, or sorry, the second set in a short rest period protocol.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the one thing, I think both of us are kind of in the camp that I definitely don't want to be like positioned as someone who doesn't think metabolic stress has any influence on hypertrophy. I think you can get at that question in a lot of interesting ways in a secondary sense. And I think we are to the point where I don't think metabolic stress is a primary driver of hypertrophy, probably. But I think it's really hard in like an ecologically valid way to remove metabolic stress as what I would say is like a modifying variable of tension. I basically view metabolic stress as like changing the quality or the type of tension that you're receiving, which sounds hand wavy, and I don't mean it to be some scientific explanation. But ultimately, the way that I view it is the metabolic stress component is kind of on a sliding scale with the load component, and it's ultimately going to mediate the ability to apply tension on the fiber level. But if we go really far down the metabolic stress spectrum to where we're no longer, we're less in the realm of resistance training now, and more so in this weird crossover of BFR with super low loads and short rest intervals, like that's not traditional resistance training in terms of the stimulus you're delivering there. And that's where we get some of these kind of wacky, weird results in the research. The Bjornsson study in powerlifters with the front squat BFR that just popped up. That's really neat. There's a few other BFR studies that are just kind of different in their findings. And we did a newsletter article where we kind of look at some strategies so in research, they often compare approach A versus approach B, and they're starkly different. But there's not as much research that takes approach A and combines it with approach B compared to only approach A. That is significantly less peppered in the research for a lot of different outcomes. But some of this stuff where you mix training strategies like BFR, different repetition ranges, things like that. And there's even a few studies that look at um, adding in a set that by other research, the loading range we wouldn't assume that it's particularly stimulative for hypertrophy on its own, but it seems to have a modifying effect, which presumably is some sort of metabolic mechanism. But that research is definitely small and limited. But there's enough sprinkling in there throughout for me to not consider myself as somebody that thinks mechanical tension is the only thing that matters. And there's probably some reason to expect that. At least it doesn't seem to be a major downside that mixing things up a little bit might not be a terrible idea, and implementing some of these other strategies, lower load sets, BFR, intensity techniques like we just talked about may, not be a terrible idea. It seems to be, roughly equivalent at best if you're able to reach task failure and you're acknowledging some of those practical things we talked about, but could have, maybe some sort of effect. But I would lean on the idea that for the most part, metabolic stress is kind of just modifying the load and the tension variable to allow that to be effective given the constraints.
And I think it's important to keep in mind that the role that metabolic stress could have is twofold, right? So let's just imagine a super simple figure here. Let's say you have muscle growth at the very bottom, and then let's say above it you have mechanical stress and metabolic stress on the same level. Mechanical stress points directly to the muscle growth component, right? Then the metabolic stress might point directly to the muscle growth component of the figure, and it almost certainly points directly to the mechanical stress component of the figure. So in other words, the metabolic stress is effectively required for these lower load type of protocols, and arguably even like moderate load type of protocols, to enhance the mechanical stress, because the metabolic stress effectively disrupts the ability for some muscle fibers to produce force given that acute fatigue from the metabolites, and thus other muscle fibers have to get into the ball game, as you outlined previously, Zach. And now those can experience high tension as well, and now that high tension can contribute to the signaling cascade and ultimately muscle growth. So that and hopefully that paints the picture as to why this is hard to investigate experimentally with applied outcomes, right? Because it's almost impossible to know, is this growth occurring because metabolic stress is just enhancing the mechanical tension, or is the metabolic stress directly contributing to the muscle growth?
Yeah, I'm with you. It's a interesting area, and I think it's one of those things where it's really challenging. And they've tried different experimental approaches to try to approximate it the best we can, like
just BFR, right?
Yeah, so that's what I was thinking of too. Is like just using BFR and things like that. But it's tough to isolate the training induced metabolic stress, which is a very specific context in which it's applied to the muscle, compared to anything else you can do. So I don't know. It's one of those things that I hope we can figure out a way to investigate it maybe a little bit more cohesively, because I think it'd be cool to know. But from a practical perspective, I think the safest bet to me is still majority of your training, the tried and true stuff, but sprinkling in some of these other things that don't seem from the applied outcomes to be that much worse, maybe is a net benefit ultimately.
Yeah. Like I like to, just like you said, sprinkle in, especially some of these, again, I'm using this term loosely, but these kind of more like metabolic stress type protocols, or just these
Finishers.
These high intercept fatigue type of protocols that are almost like, I don't expect true failure to actually be possible. So these would be like pretty extreme drop set type protocols or BFR type protocols, because of some of the acorns you kind of see in the research with these, right? You mentioned the Bjornsson study in powerlifters. There's another one who I can't think of the lead author right now that was in very well trained. I think they might have even been bodybuilders, and they saw pretty like like the hypertrophy results really jumped off the page there when they implemented blood flow restriction. Um, on balance, it doesn't seem like blood flow restriction is like this magical thing, but it's also not doesn't seem to be reliably worse. So there's probably no downside to this kind of mixed modal approach, sprinkling in these sorts of things here and there. And there's maybe even an argument to be made that kind of changing the way at which you elicit the mechanical tension, or maybe if the metabolic stress does have a direct effect on muscle growth, that that can have an additive effect, or you could resensitize these specific pathways. Now we're getting into very speculative territory, but I see little downside beyond some additional complexity uh, to sprinkling in low load training, sprinkling in BFR, sprinkling in drop sets, and then myo reps kind of being that one that, okay, this could very reasonably make up a good amount of someone's training if they're looking to get a given dose of training in less time.
100%. No, I agree with that. I think, yeah, I was going to potentially send us down the muscle damage rabbit hole to round out the mechanisms, but I'm going to hold that for another episode, folks. I don't know. Do you
Can
have
I
anything else,
summarize?
Josh, or you want to close it out?
Can I summarize?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so and yeah, like we obviously like to get down rabbit holes and kind of speculate, and the long form stuff here is key for that because we can add caution appropriately, and hopefully in the process of talking through these things, you can get an idea of what's less certain and what we're more confident in, and kind of ultimately the underlying principles here. But you know, we ultimately we care about results in the next few months, not necessarily waiting 5 years to know exactly how this stuff works. More like 50 years, right? Um, so let's bring it back home, right? What ultimately matters when it comes to making a muscle grow? Well, it seems like ensuring the quality of the training uh, is absolutely vital. And when I say quality, I view that as kind of encompassing two things. The first being exercise selection and execution, right? So ensuring that the muscle being trained is actually limiting you in that movement as you get closer to failure. That doesn't mean other things can't play a role and maybe get some stimulus as well, but the target muscle is kind of what's limiting you as you approach failure. The second component of quality is proximity to failure. And I think that is easy to just say, oh, yeah, make sure you get close to failure. But then also, you have to layer in under what conditions can we be more confident that a close proximity to failure is actually possible and feasible. And those specifically talking about proximity to failure, that's what leads us to bring some caution to some of these advanced training techniques uh, and shorter rest period type training, because it might be more difficult to ensure training quality in those scenarios. Further, another reason to add caution to anything that's not straight sets is that you can make the argument. I'm sure other people would have different perspectives, but from my perspective, I would say that straight sets with solid rest periods are a little bit more tested, right? Both in the research and just kind of in the trenches. So I kind of view that as like the the control here, or
Yeah, it's like the
the
null, the null.
yeah, it's the null here, and you kind of have to prove to me that I should stray from that for most of my training. And then you say, okay, it's just kind of this risk reward, or this kind of balancing act in terms of weighing the pros and cons, and the level of uncertainty here, and that leads me to still prescribe straight set training with enough rest to feel ready to rock for the next set as the bulk of someone's program, but then layer in these other sorts of protocols that rely on kind of essentially this amplification of acute fatigue uh, in scenarios primarily either just for fun, or uh, the number one being to save time. And I would kind of lean towards myo reps as the first lever I pull there to save time. But again, with the kind of layer of caution that there is less research behind that, there's more uncertainty, and it might compromise your ability to train close to failure, um, you know, throughout like most of those protocols. Is that a fair summarization?
Money.
Cool. Um, Man, we I think we did that pretty justice. We definitely could have talked more about the more like chronic fatigue or like time course of recovery from different advanced strategies. We could have talked about strength for sure and why the strength game is completely different. Uh, and we could talk about something else that's escaping me. But hey, hopefully this was still a solid episode. Maybe we'll save that for next time. If you're not subscribed to the YouTube channel, make sure you are. If you're not subscribed to the newsletter, make sure you are. Um, I think that's all I got.
Yeah. Honestly, I think this was a good one. Let us know if you want to hear us ramble about anything else in the comments below. But other than that, make sure you subscribe to your to the podcast on your podcast player of choice. Give
Some good
this thing
episodes coming.
five. Yeah, new episode. Yeah, big episodes coming. We are still in the process of, as you've probably noticed, the navigation to YouTube and kind of figuring out the direction of the content sources. But we have some big plans for the podcast moving forward. Some good conversations on some good stuff. So make sure to subscribe and give us 5 stars so we can keep getting it out there. So without further ado, folks, we'll see you in the next episode. And thank you very much.
Peace.